Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsey Report. And now, Hal Lindsey.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. Israel and its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recently faced a series of storms. Remarkably, the Prime Minister is still on his feet. During November, Israel teetered on the edge of another war in Gaza. In less than a week, Hamas fired more than 400 rockets into southern Israel. Israel's Iron Dome defense struck down many of them, and still other Hamas missiles struck their targets. But only 9 Israeli civilians were injured. The IDF responded by striking about 70 Hamas targets. Netanyahu said, "We were a step away from exerting maximum force," and I think Hamas understood this. Cabinet Minister Michael Oren said that Israel will do whatever it takes to defend itself, and we expect the world to stand with us. On November 13th, Hamas sent word to the Israelis that they wanted a ceasefire. Later that day, Hamas announced that it had reached an agreement with Israel. An Israeli spokesman said only that Israel reserves the freedom to operate. But when Hamas stopped launching its missiles, Israel stopped its operation as well. Some Israelis welcomed the news of a ceasefire. Others were outraged, especially those living in the areas struck by Hamas missiles. The next day, Israel's outspoken defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, resigned from the government. He called for early elections. Lieberman believes that Israel gave immunity to Hamas leaders by agreeing to the ceasefire too soon. His party's withdrawal from the government coalition left Netanyahu with only 61 of 120 Knesset members. That's when Education Minister Naftali Bennett threatened to resign if he was not given the job of defense minister. His withdrawal would have wrecked Netanyahu's coalition and forced early elections. But the Prime Minister didn't buckle to the pressure. He decided to take on the defense portfolio himself. The truce with Hamas has been uneasy. On some days, as many as 10,000 Gazans have gathered at the border. Several were injured by Hamas security forces trying to keep them back. During the fighting, Donald Trump's envoy to the Middle East, Jason Greenblatt, said, "Gaza terrorists are once again attacking Israel with rockets and mortars. Israel must once again use military force to protect its citizens. We stand with Israel in its defense against these attacks." Then he added something that is obvious, but missed by much of the world. He said, "This violence is preventing true assistance to the people of Gaza. Hamas has shown once again that it sees the common citizen of Gaza as expendable in their war against Israel." A few weeks ago, I briefly mentioned a bizarre ruling by the European Court of Human Rights, or ECHR. The court decided that in Europe, freedom of expression no longer applied to anyone saying anything negative about Muhammad, even if it's true. It's a crucial case for several reasons. First, as we're about to see, it throws logic out the window. It's like we've stepped into the middle of George Orwell's novel, 1984. It's a case of what Orwell called doublethink. The court simultaneously holds 2 contradictory positions. The case began in 2011 when an Austrian woman was convicted of denigrating religious symbols of a recognized religious group. At a small seminar of less than 30 people, she talked about Muhammad's marriage to a 6-year-old girl. She said, a 56-year-old and a 6-year-old. What do we call it if it is not pedophilia? According to documents that Muslims themselves hold sacred, she was telling the truth. One of the hadiths says Muhammad married Aisha when she was a girl of 6 years of age, and he consummated that marriage when she was 9 years old. His defenders pointed out that they did not live together as man and wife until she was 9? But is that really a defense? A 59-year-old and a 9-year-old? It's still pedophilia. Others say that social norms have changed in the last 1,400 years. That's true for most people, but not for Muslims who see Muhammad as their example. Earlier this year, a man in Cleveland married a 9-year-old girl. He justified his actions by pointing to Muhammad. 2 years ago, a Canadian Muslim scholar and imam said that a man of 50 marrying a girl of 9 is legitimate in Islam. Whether the hadiths are telling the truth or not, Muslims believe it, and some of them act accordingly. When the woman called Muhammad a pedophile, there were no Muslims in the audience to be offended, but a reporter was present and had snuck in a recorder. The Reporter's magazine then interjected itself into the story. The magazine filed a complaint with authorities. An Austrian court convicted her of disparaging religious doctrines. She appealed the conviction, and it made its way to the European Court of Human Rights. The ECHR ruled that the Austrian court carefully balanced her right to freedom of expression with the right of others to have their religious feelings protected and served the legitimate aim of preserving religious peace in Austria. Is there really a right to have religious feelings protected? True freedom of religion does not mean that your feelings are protected. True religious freedom often results in vigorous discussion and debate. That means disagreements. But among Christians, Jews, and most other faith groups, simple discussion does not threaten the peace of the nation. The ECHR apparently sees Islam as volatile and dangerous, something to be appeased. Just as I described on this program last week, writing for the Gatestone Institute, Judith Bergman said, the real message the ECHR sent as it succumbed to fear of disturbing the religious peace is that if threats work, keep threatening. But here is what makes the European Court's action so insane and so dangerous. In a previous case, that same court ruled that freedom of expression doesn't just protect the information or ideas that are favorably received or regarded as inoffensive or as a matter of indifference, but also those that offend, shock, or disturb. That's the exact opposite of its recent ruling. In fact, the court has ruled in favor of freedom of expression in all kinds of controversial cases over the years, but not this time. Once again, Islam received preferential treatment. This ruling implies that all Europeans are now expected to follow Sharia law regarding what they say about Muhammad. Say something offensive about Islam, even if it is true, and the courts will throw you in jail. It's like the horrific Spanish Inquisition, which lasted 350 years. But this time, Islam is a protected group. According to conventional wisdom, unrest in the Middle East is primarily a conflict between Arabs and Israelis. The common reasoning is that if Israel would just give the Palestinians a homeland, the Arabs would be satisfied and peace would reign. If you believe that, I have some lakefront property in the Sahara Desert I'd like to sell you. The history of the Middle East and Islam is overflowing with tribal warfare, imperial ambitions, and oppression for non-believers. Jihad, our holy war, is fundamental to their faith. Once they're in political power, Islam requires followers to either convert or eliminate every non-Muslim in its path. But Muslims also fight each other. Sunnis and Shias are the two main factions of Islam. They went to war with one another shortly after Muhammad's death in the year 632. That war continues to this day. But that's not the only internal Islamic war. Today, a worldwide jihad exists between nominal or cultural Muslims and the more radical and devout Muslims. Because jihad is fundamental to Islam, Muslims will always find someone to fight. That means that the unrest in the Middle East is not Israel's fault. It also means that Islam is anything but a religion of peace. It is a violent and warmongering political and religious system. Yet across Europe and even in parts of the United States, it is being embraced as a new state religion. European nations have long favored their own state religion. But how did Islam get into that category? In Europe, as in the United States, people often advocate the complete separation of church and state. But many of those same people happily embrace mosque and state. Why do democratic nations want to adopt a belief system that is opposed to democracy? In all the Middle East, only Israel remains a working democracy. That's because it is built on Moses and the prophets, not the Quran. Democracy worked in Turkey for a long time, but in those days, Turkey prided itself on secularism. Today, the Muslims of Turkey have done what Muslims do repeatedly. They have voted away the power of the vote. They voted themselves out of the political process. Look at Palestinians. In Gaza, Hamas won a legislative election in 2006. It then forcibly took over Gaza. There have been no more elections there. The Fatah party is depicted in the media as moderates and democracy-friendly. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas is the leader of the party. He is now in the 14th year of his 4-year term as president. The Palestinian Authority had one presidential election. Abbas won, and that was that. Reading a list of the most Muslim nations on earth is like reading a nightmare of dysfunction. Human rights violations are routine. Among the worst are the Palestinian territories. Why then does a new American Congresswoman celebrate her election victory by dancing with a Palestinian flag? Rashida Tlaib was born in Detroit to Palestinian immigrants. She still considers herself Palestinian, not Palestinian American. just Palestinian. During her acceptance speech, she said,
"You know, a lot of my strength comes from being Palestinian."
"A lot of my strength comes from being Palestinian." In August, she retweeted something one of her followers sent out. It said that her first fight was for Palestine, always Palestine. Not only does she support the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement against Israel, she supports the absolute and complete destruction of Israel. When Palestinians talk about a one-state solution, they mean one Palestinian state that replaces Israel. When asked if she supported a one-state solution, she answered, "One state. It has to be one state. Separate but equal does not work." Her call for the destruction of Israel puts her dangerously close to the Iranian-backed terror group Islamic Jihad. They have proclaimed the war is open until Israel ceases to exist and until the last Jew in the world is eliminated. Israel is all evil and should be wiped out of existence. Palestinians are the minority in Israel, but she believes they should be given charge of a single government called Palestine. The terrorist Yasser Arafat remains an iconic hero to the Palestinian people. He was very clear about the goals of the Palestine Liberation Organization. He said, "Our objective is simply the liberation of the Palestinian soil and the establishment of a Palestinian state over every part of it. Thus, the Jews must be removed and Israel must be annihilated. We can accept nothing less." An American TV show recently depicted a supposedly Christian minister speaking of Islam as a beautiful faith. But Islam is not beautiful, and it's not just a faith. It is an unbending and repressive political system. It calls for the murder of those who disagree with it. It considers women to be property. It destroys lives wherever it goes. Many Europeans are now waking up to the dangers of Islam. Sadly, it may be too late, but in America, it's not too late. We need to treat every Muslim with respect and care, but we need to understand that their ideas are radioactive. Islam is at odds with any constitution other than Sharia. A recent article in the Washington Post condemned the method of children's punishment known as the Timeout. It gave several reasons. First, they said it doesn't work. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm more concerned with their next line of attack. They said the method is dated. The headline read, "Timeouts are a dated and ineffective parenting strategy. What does its age have to do with anything? And it's not really very old." Timeouts became popular back in the 1980s. How's that for dated? I'm concerned that a generation of young parents tend to see anything not invented in the century as old and useless. The wisdom of the Greek philosophers? Dated. The literature of Shakespeare, Tolstoy, and Twain? Too old to be good. After all, they wrote things that require the efforts of thought, and they used more than 280 characters. Remember when ISIS destroyed ancient works of art wherever they came into power. Something similar is happening in the West. We're throwing away a heritage more than 6,000 years in the making because it's dated. We're abandoning the timeless and replacing it with the temporary. The result is a generation as shallow as a thimble of water. Writing for the Post, Claire Gillespie gave another reason for ending the timeout. Most experts agree that punishment is harmful to a child's emotional development and that isolation, the defining quality of the timeout technique, is a form of punishment. Loving, fair, and consistent punishment is not harmful. It is necessary. The ancient wisdom most under attack in our age can be found in the Bible. Proverbs 13, verse 24 says, "He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently." Proverbs chapter 22:15 says, "Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline will remove it far from him." Some have used these verses as an excuse for the abuse of children, but that's not what God means here at all. He's talking about the appropriate use of punishment to steer a child in the way he or she should live. According to Proverbs chapter 19, verse 18, a firm hand of discipline may very well save your child's life. Discipline your son while there is hope, and do not desire his death. Discipline leads to obedience, and obedience to life. One of the 10 Commandments says, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged." Learning to obey parents is a matter of life and death. Most of the stories I present on this program relate in one way or another to Bible prophecy. So does this one. 2 Timothy 3 says, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come." That chapter goes on to describe what people will be like in the last days. You've heard this list before, but this time, as you hear it, consider this. These are the characteristics of people who have been raised without discipline. Men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. How do parents raise such self-centered people? By following the formulas laid out in most modern child-rearing books. Anyone who thinks this no-touch policy is a good idea needs to get out more. Walk through a grocery store or any public place. Watch children interact with parents. It's scary, but there is hope. Psalms 107 verse 20 says, "He sent his word and healed them and delivered them from their destruction." This generation and all generations need the healing found in God's word. We need what John 1 calls the Logos, the Word, Jesus. Well, that's it for tonight, folks. God willing, I'll see you next week.
You've been watching the Hal Lindsey Report. To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.